army officials through reconciliation centers. The caretaker authorities have issued the first list of military appointments in the new Ministry of Defense. These appear to be drawn from a range of factions, including Hayat Tahrir al Sham, and also include fighters from foreign countries. The caretaker authorities have held meetings with a very broad range of representatives and individuals of different Syrian groups and components. They also met with visiting foreign ministers and senior officials, and the caretaker foreign minister, al-Shabani, has just returned from a regional visit. Mr. President, my second point. There are signs of instability within areas under the control of the caretaker authorities. While there are many areas where law and order appears to be good, we have seen multiple reports of incidents of violence in the coastal region and Homs and Hama in particular, including accounts of degrading and humiliating treatment. Caretaker authorities have also carried out patrols and what they term combing operations, arresting former officials or elements that they accuse of war crimes or of refusing to hand in weapons and settle. There have been some reports of clashes with what are described as former regime elements, resulting in casualties, including from within the caretaker authorities. There have been videos circulating of what appear to be abuses or extrajudicial killings of officials from the former regime, though we note reports of the caretaker authorities arresting some perpetrators. There are also reports that plans for public sector restructuring may leave many without livelihoods, which may push them into need and further jeopardize stability. On this and on all issues, we urge the caretaker authorities to extend the hand of reassurances and trust to all communities in Syria, fostering the active engagement of all in building the new Syria. Mr. President, third point, there are significant areas outside the control of the caretaker authorities. The conflict continues, and there are also very real threats to Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. The northeast, as well as part of Aleppo city, remain under the control of SDF and YPG. Despite a US-brokered ceasefire near Manbij in December, there have been reports of clashes and exchanges of artillery fire between the SDF and the Syrian National Army forces in particular. Turkey has made statements indicating a clear possibility that Turkish military operations could intensify in the northeast. At the same time, channels of dialogue have been established between the caretaker authorities and the SDF, who met last week in Damascus. Public statements suggest the charting out of positions, but not yet the prospect of imminent agreement. Mr. President, I continue to call for and support the further development of all channels of dialogue and to urge all parties to find a way forward without military confrontation. We are deeply concerned by continued Israeli military presence and activity, including beyond the area of separation in violation of the 1974 disengagement agreement. Furthermore, restrictions on UNDOF's freedom of movement imposed by IDF should be lifted without delay. Attacks on Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity must stop. Reports of the IDF using live ammunition against civilians, displacement and destruction of civilian infrastructure are also very worrying. Such violations, along with Israeli airstrikes in other parts of Syria, reported even last week in Aleppo, could further jeopardize the prospects for an orderly political transition. ISIL remains a significant concern, with ongoing ISIL activities and worries that they may seek to take advantage of security flux in some areas. US-led coalition operations against ISIL continued, including US and French targeted airstrikes. Mr. President, my fourth point, the needs of the Syrian people remain acute. Tom will obviously say more on this, but access to basic and essential services, including healthcare, water, and electricity and housing, remain enormous challenges. The obstacles to the return of IDPs and refugees remain considerable, particularly lack of livelihoods, damaged and destroyed infrastructure, and also widespread landmines, resulting in mounting casualties. I welcome the recent issuance of a new temporary general license by the United States government, but much more significant work in fully addressing sanctions and designations will inevitably be necessary. Mr. President, my fifth point. The way forward on political transition is unclear. There are positive developments to build on, but also points of concern that Syrians are expressing. The leadership initially projected that the current caretaker authorities would operate for up to 3 months in order to ensure no state collapse, followed by broader transitional arrangements. However, there are significant decisions or positions being taken that many Syrians feel should be left to a more inclusive transitional phase, such as articulating positions on the character of the state before a constitutional phase, such as issuing long-term policy decisions with regards to the security sector, or in fields such as education. In the wide-ranging interview, Mr. Ahmed al-Shara stated that there would be a national dialogue process which would be inclusive and comprehensive of many of the Syrian sects, with voting on important and critical issues that should be the foundation of the transitional period. He spoke of a constitution drafting process carried out by experts that could take 2 to 3 years. He spoke of elections that could take up to 4 years, given what he says are necessary preparations, including civil documentation and population data. Some Syrians have received signals from the caretaker authorities positively, especially in terms of stressing inclusiveness and the need to engage a broad spectrum of Syrians in shaping the transitional phase and to draw on expertise of Syrians of all kinds. But at the same time, Mr. President, we have heard concerns at the lack of transparency on the timing, framework, goals, procedures in any national dialogue conference, as well as participation in terms of criteria for attendance and balance of representation. It is crucially important, Mr. President, that the process is not rushed and that it is well prepared and thought through. In this regard, I welcome the fact that the caretaker authorities have now clarified publicly that the conference has been delayed until an expanded preparatory committee can be formed that includes what was called comprehensive representation of Syria from all segments and governance. Mr. President, this leads to my sixth point. We are ready to work with the caretaker authorities on how the nascent and important ideas and steps so far articulated and initiated could be developed towards a credible and inclusive political transition. Further to this Council's important press statement of 17 December, I believe it is well understood that Resolution 2254 cannot be applied in a literal manner. For instance, the former regime will not be a party to any future process, and there are, of course, other examples too. Clearly, there is a need for a new approach and modes of thinking on many fronts. But that being said, there is a wide consensus that the transition does still need to achieve the main things that Resolution 2254 laid out. First, a credible, inclusive and transparent Syrian-led and owned transition. And on this, let me be clear, Mr. President. I do not believe any Syrian is asking for quotas based on sect or ethnicity or importing models from other countries, but rather including the broadest spectrum of Syrian society and Syrian parties so as to inspire public confidence in the transition. Second, ensuring a credible, inclusive and non-sectarian transitional government. Third, a new constitution prepared through a credible and inclusive process. Fourth, free and fair elections, inclusive of all Syrians, in accordance with international standards. Mr. President, Syrian women these past weeks have reinforced their expectations and intent to participate in decision-making throughout the transition process and beyond, at national and local levels. They stress their expectation that any constitutional revision safeguards women's rights and evolved roles and status. Syrian women have much to contribute, and the country should grasp this collective capacity fully. Mr. President, let me also stress that the call for justice, accountability and reparation is being strongly echoed across different spectrums of society and is a necessary and fundamental safeguard to sustainable peace and social cohesion. This is a long process, obviously, but immediate practical steps are necessary, such as access and authorization for specialized organizations, both local and international, to undertake their work on preservation and documentation. Syrians have accumulated years of work on these issues that must be built on and optimized. So too has the United Nations, including the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the Commission of Inquiry, and the newly established independent institutions on missing persons, all of which have a fundamental role to play today. Mr. President, the points I have described are widely shared among a broad spectrum of Syrians, civil society activists, women, and political forces. I take good note of the fact that the caretaker authorities' leadership have spoken of the need for inclusiveness, including participation from different components, as well as the need for a new constitution and elections. There are therefore tremendous opportunities for building a foundation for lasting peace and stability in Syria. But, Mr. President, missteps and missed opportunities could pose risks to Syria's future and plant seeds of instability. But I do believe that common ground on these issues could be readily developed in a dialogue with the caretaker authorities. And there is genuine expertise and support that can be made available to support a Syrian-led process. Mr. President, I also firmly believe that working on an inclusive political transition is the most effective means to inspire confidence and ensure that Syria quickly receives the economic support that it desperately needs, which requires in turn a smooth end to sanctions, appropriate action on destinations too, and major funding, including for reconstruction. I have informally and formally sought to follow up with the caretaker authorities on the transition and all related issues in an open manner and in partnership. and I believe it is vital that this take place. In order to provide all necessary engagement and support, we are already moving to strengthen the presence and expertise of our political mission in Damascus. And there is active UN planning to ensure delivery as one across all themes of potential support to a credible and inclusive transition. My Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi and many members of my team are in Syria to follow up and to conduct further outreach with a wide range of Syrians. And, Mr. President, I would hope to return to Damascus at the earliest possible time. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Pedersen for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Tom Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to Special Envoy Pedersen. Mr. President, recent weeks have been less turbulent than those that preceded our last discussion, but the scale of the humanitarian crisis remains as significant. Following my briefing to you from Damascus, I traveled to Homs, Aleppo, and Idlib to meet Syrian civilians and humanitarians. As Special Envoy Pedersen underlined, we must seize the opportunity of this moment. These visits underscored three critical humanitarian challenges that we and the people of Syria face. First, the need to preserve and rebuild essential services. Health services, already weakened by years of conflict, have been further closed or scaled back at a time when nearly 15 million people require humanitarian health support. Access to water has been restricted, including by fighting at the Tishreen Dam in eastern Aleppo, affecting water and electricity for more than 400,000 people. And close to 13 million people are still facing acute food insecurity, at a time when WFP has been forced to reduce food assistance by 80% in the past 2 years due to funding shortfalls. Lack of food, water, and power is exacerbated by lack of fuel and liquidity. A second priority, protection of civilians. While many of those uprooted in November and December have returned to their homes, more than 620,000 people remain displaced, as harsh winter conditions arrive in many parts of the country. This comes on top of the more than 7 million who were already displaced. In the northwest alone, 2 million people remain in camps and informal sites. In Idlib, I met some of those civilians at Tajma Alij camp. Most want to return home, but cite a lack of adequate services and infrastructure damage, as well as unexploded munitions. And in Aleppo, I met children injured by the deadly legacy of conflict. Partners have identified more than 100 contaminated locations since late November across Aleppo, Idlib, Hama, and Latakia. Meanwhile, airstrikes have killed civilians and damaged civilian infrastructure. And in the south, Israeli incursions have forced civilians, including children, injured, and residents, to evacuate parts of Quneitra Governorate. A third priority, a third risk, the threat that women and girls will be marginalized. Throughout my visit, I was struck by their determination to contribute to Syria's future. Rayan, a 12-year-old girl in Aleppo who lost her leg to unexploded ordnance, hopes to be a doctor. Zainab, whose husband was held at Sednaya prison for years and who received his death certificate the morning that we met, wants to see her children complete their education. Jamila, raising 4 children alone, wants to pursue a university degree. Syria's future depends on women like Rayan, Zainab, Jamila. Their voices must be heard in this critical period. Mr. President, as the security situation has stabilized, we've been able to resume our humanitarian operations at much greater scale. In December, we sent 298 trucks of aid through border crossings with Turkey, as many as crossed during the previous 6 months. WHO has supported an EU humanitarian air bridge, providing 50 tons of supplies to northern Syria. In the northeast, a cholera vaccination campaign is underway in Hol camp. UNICEF and partners have led work to restore the functioning of the Tishreen Dam and to rehabilitate other water supplies, including the Ain al-Baida station. WFP and partners have provided bread for more than 2.5 million people. Children and mothers are receiving treatment for malnutrition, but we must do more. We will this month roll out a countrywide rapid needs assessment. We are also adjusting our coordination structures to meet the new operational context. Mr. President, as ever, I have 3 asks of the Security Council. Firstly, your support for the clear assurances that I received from the caretaker authorities that international humanitarian law will be respected, civilians protected, and humanitarian organizations allowed to operate freely. We are continuing our engagement with the caretaker authorities on putting in place new ways of working, including new procedures for registering NGOs. We remain in daily contact on practicalities, and I assess that partnership to be serious and genuine. But security, particularly in Aleppo, Deir ez-Zor, Latakia, and Tartus, remains a challenge. Occasional theft and looting have impeded vaccination support in Homs and insulin supply in Hama. And capacity gaps clearly remain. My second ask, as ever, money, including for the longer-term support that Syria needs. Our humanitarian response is only a third funded. Today, I've allocated from the UN's Central Emergency Response Fund an additional $8 million, for a total of $20 million to support the rapid scaling up of humanitarian operations in Syria. And we welcome recent aid announcements for Syria, including, importantly, from the region. The UN and partners encourage donors to coordinate even more closely to ensure that this support has the greatest benefit, collectively, for people across the country. My third ask, we need to ensure efficient flow of support into and through Syria. This means that sanctions should not impede humanitarian support. The United States announcement of a new general license covering transactions with Syrian governing institutions provides a welcome signal. This also means support for and from Syria's neighbors. Following my visit to Syria, I held practical discussions with authorities in Turkey, in Lebanon, and in Jordan. Operations are continuing at scale through border crossings with Turkey, but cross-line movement remains a challenge in the northeast of Syria. Existing procedures, including for movement of aid workers, have been reinstated at the Lebanese border crossing. The Jabal Nasib crossing with Jordan is also operational, though procedures for humanitarian movements are still being clarified. We are working with the caretaker authorities in Damascus to swiftly establish clear procedures at this crossing and at the seaports. We are also testing deliveries through Iraq to complement existing movements by NGO partners. Mr. President, the active engagement of this Council and the international community remains vital in this period of uneasy transition. We need to act with great urgency and vigor. Above all, and all power to Special Envoy Pedersen's elbow, we need the peaceful political transition that will help us to reduce humanitarian needs. We must stand with the people of Syria at this time. The humanitarian operation can make great impact if we are serious, bold, and committed in their support. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Fletcher for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Special Envoy Pedersen and Undersecretary General Fletcher, for your briefings. As we have made clear, the United States supports a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process in the spirit of UN Security Council Resolution 2254. This process should result in an inclusive and representative government that fully respects the human rights and fundamental freedoms of all Syrians, including women and Syria's diverse communities. The transition process and resulting Syrian government must also ensure that any elements of a remaining chemical weapons program are identified, secured, and safely destroyed under international verification. We are encouraged by the cooperation to date and call for the continued commitment of relevant actors in Syria to work with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, the United Nations, and other state and non-state partners to chart a course for the complete and verifiable elimination of any remaining elements of a chemical weapons program. We emphasize the importance of identifying Syrian points of contact to work with the OPCW to set this plan in motion and to provide the security and safety guarantees for OPCW personnel to conduct their verification work. It is also vital for actors in Syria to allow access for UN entities, other international organizations, and civil society to secure documentation, safeguard mass graves and prisons, and assist released detainees and the family of those whose whereabouts remain unknown. As we have noted previously, we were encouraged to hear about the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the IIIM, visit to Syria, and the announcement of a new head of the Independent Institution on Missing Persons, IIMP. We urge interim entities to work closely with these institutions and civil society partners. We further urge Syria's interim entities to deter individual acts of vengeance and to partner with the IIIM to identify paths to ensure accountability. Colleagues, the United States welcomes positive messages from Hayat Tahrir al Sham, but will ultimately look for progress in actions, not words. We will explore policies and priorities, or we're looking for actions and words that will explore policies and priorities and prioritize the well-being of the Syrian people. Earlier this week, the United States issued General License Number 24 to expand authorizations for activities and transactions in Syria following December 8, 2024. The General License underscores our commitment to ensuring that U.S. sanctions do not impede activities to meet basic human needs, including the provision of public services or humanitarian assistance. This authorization is for 6 months as the United States continues to monitor the evolving situation on the ground. The United States is committed to assisting Syrians in this extraordinary moment to forge a new future for and by its people. It is critical all external actors be mindful of the need to maintain stability in Syria. Syria should not be used as a platform to extend other countries' interests at the expense of the Syrian people. Syria's interim entities must ensure the country does not pose a threat to its neighbors, serve as a base for terrorism, or give refuge to groups like the Islamic State or Daesh. In northeast Syria, maintaining the security of detention facilities and displaced persons camps and repatriating foreign nationals remain integral to prevent ISIS's resurgence and promote stability in the region. We look forward to helping secure a brighter future for the Syrian people who desperately need our support and help Syria reclaim its rightful place regionally.
Federation.
Mr. President, we thank Special Envoy Pedersen and the head of OCHA, Tom Fletcher, for their briefings on the situation in the Syrian Arab Republic, the developments in which are being closely followed by the entire international community. Our friends, the brotherly Syrian people that we have always and will continue to provide support, are going through a new stage in their history. For the time being, it's hard to clearly assess the processes taking place on the territory of Syria. Often they are extremely contradictory in nature. We have not yet seen the resumption of the work of key state institutions and vitally important companies. It is not clear how the inclusive nature of the authorities of the future Syria will be ensured, the need for which we are all declaring. There is a fairly high risk of the intensification of hostilities that have encompassed many regions of the country, in particular Aleppo, Deir ez-Zor, Homs and Quneitra. There are also ongoing clashes in the north and the area beyond the Euphrates. In other words, Syria has more than enough problems, and their severity should in no case be underestimated. We would in particular like to point to the direct threat to the territorial integrity of Syria borne by the unlawful actions of Israel, which is carrying out a policy of fait accompli on the occupied Golan Heights, and 500 square kilometers of Syrian land have already been seized. The actions of Israel are a gross violation of international legal decisions, including the many decisions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. We call upon colleagues on the Security Council and also the representatives of the Secretariat of the World Organization to give an honest assessment of events. Mr. President, in these circumstances, Syria continues to face a dire humanitarian crisis that we have heard about today from the head of OCHA. Millions of citizens of this long-suffering country continue to experience serious food shortages and a lack of necessary medical care. That situation has been consistently made worse by Washington, which for several years essentially has occupied the most resource-rich northeastern region of Syria and is also exerting heavy sanctions pressure on Damascus and encouraging its satellites to do the same. As a result, the Syrian economy is under extreme pressure and is not able to cope with the challenges facing the country. Against this extremely worrying backdrop, international humanitarian agencies that have been deprived of their main partners from the Syrian Red Crescent have been forced to start the provision of assistance literally from scratch. Israeli airstrikes and shelling, as well as the rampant violence seen in many regions, is causing suffering, losses among the civilian population, and interrupting the work of civilian infrastructure objects. Regular reports of the disabling of vitally important infrastructure are, of course, of concern. More than 400,000 people in the suburbs of Manbij and Kobani have been left without water and electricity after the hydroelectric power plant at Tishreen stopped working. In the southern part of Idlib and the north of Hama, power grids and roads have been destroyed. Hospitals and primary medical care centers in general across the country are extremely overburdened. In this connection, the primary aim of the new Syrian authorities is we see as being stopping the bloodshed that is lashing the country. The events are not adding to stability, and the past month has forced hundreds of thousands of ordinary Syrians to leave their homes. The conditions that those people are in remain extremely serious. Many of them have been deprived of access to clean water, sanitary conditions, and basic hygiene products. That situation must fundamentally change for the better as soon as possible, and that is something that the overwhelming majority of residents of Syria are in favor of. Mr. President, we all understand that the new authorities need to go a long way in order to rectify the dire socioeconomic situation and establish an effectively functioning state organs. And of course, in order to do that, they need the support of the international community. That, in our view, should be the focus of the efforts of the UN Security Council. Without outside support based on the principles of humanity and impartiality, Syrians simply will not be able to withstand the tests that they have faced. It's extremely important that assistance is provided to all Syrians in all parts of the country without politicization, discrimination, or preconditions. We regret that donors are not keeping their pledges, and the humanitarian plan for 2024 is financed only at a third. This is despite the significant increase in the already vast needs. They're also not easing illegal unilateral sanctions that are worsening the suffering of the civilian population. It's also important to understand that the Syrian events did not take place in a vacuum. They took place against the backdrop of the ongoing unprecedented escalation of violence in the region that began from Gaza and extended to the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. The extremely dangerous, provocative rhetoric against Tehran is also not abating. In our view, particular responsibility is borne here by the USA, which has blocked all decisions for a ceasefire in Gaza so as not to prevent West Jerusalem from continuing its military operation there. We regret that, because of Washington, the Council has still not been able to fulfill its direct mandate for the maintenance of peace and security. Mr. President, we all also understand very well that Syria will not have a worthy future unless there is a resilient political process. In these circumstances, the key provisions of the Fundamental Security Council Resolution 2254 on the political transition remain fully relevant, as well as the inclusive nature of the political process. Of continued relevance are the demands in the resolution to respect the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria. Impinging upon those foundations or attempts to replace them are unacceptable and could have irreversible consequences for the future of this country. We are convinced that Syrians and Syrians alone, through an inclusive national dialogue, must determine the future of their country, and we call upon all responsible members of the international community to strictly adhere to this approach and to provide the people of Syria all the assistance they need. At the same time, it is unacceptable for there to be any competition among the key external players and neighbors of Syria, the advancing of self-serving agendas or geopolitical interests in the Syrian arena. In this context, we support the efforts of Special Envoy Pedersen for nationwide de-escalation, the resumption of the political process with UN mediation, and the convening of an international conference on Syria with a broad range of participants. Unless all of these approaches are consolidated, the building of a new Syria will be doomed to fail. We very much hope that the Special Envoy will be able to ensure a worthy role in the Syrian settlement for the UN. That would be in line with the long-term interests of this country, the Middle East, and the entire international community. Russia stands ready to participate in those efforts for the sake of the Syrian people and its neighbors. We intend in particular to continue to provide the Syrian people with all sorts of assistance, including through specialized international agencies, through the supply of humanitarian assistance, the reconstruction of social infrastructure objects destroyed during the conflict, and the creation of a material basis for the return of Syrian refugees and internally displaced persons. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Undersecretary General Fletcher for their briefings and also for their strong engagement on this file in the past intense weeks. Exactly 1 month ago, a new day dawned in Syria. The world watched in astonishment as the fall of the Assad regime inspired hope in millions of Syrians. The hope of a bright and just future for all Syrians to live in freedom and dignity, and future in which the stability, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Syria is upheld. Denmark shares that same hope and stands firmly in solidarity with the Syrian people, who for more than half a century suffered under a brutal dictatorship. Mr. President, there are many facets of this new developing situation, but let me focus on 4. First, the humanitarian crisis in Syria remains extremely dire. As we heard from the USG this morning, even reports of more aid coming in, the combination of winter weather and severe underfunding of the humanitarian response plan leaves millions of Syrians lacking basic means to survive. Denmark has scaled up our funding for Syria, and we urge all donors to do the same. Aid deliveries through all possible means must continue and increase. Humanitarian access to and through areas affected by the conflict must also be ensured. We thank Switzerland for their tireless efforts as the humanitarian penholder on this file and assure the Council of Denmark's steadfast commitment to improving the humanitarian situation across Syria as we take over this role. Second, Mr. President, only with justice can the deep scars of more than a decade of violence begin to heal. Images of torture prisons and mass graves highlight the need for accountability for the crimes of the Assad regime. For far too long, families of missing persons have agonized, the whereabouts of their loved ones unknown. Certainty about the thousands of disappeared Syrians must be established. Denmark fully supports the Commission of Inquiry, the Independent Institution on Missing Persons, and the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, or IIIM. We welcome the interim authorities' call to provide justice for the thousands of torture victims of the Assad regime and encourage them to launch a broad and inclusive transitional justice process. As an immediate measure, we urge the interim authorities to promptly secure all evidence of crime found in prisons, government offices, and archives, and ensure that they can be preserved for future proceedings. We welcome the UN Commission of Inquiry's first visit to Syria and call for the interim authorities to cooperate with the Commission. Mr. President, my third point relates to the security situation. Denmark commends the efforts undertaken to de-escalate the violence inside Syria, including between SNA and the SDF. De-escalation is the first step on the path to political dialogue. Denmark also underscores the importance of the continued fight against terrorism. Terrorist groups such as ISIL or Daesh, Al-Qaeda and their affiliates should not be allowed to take advantage of the situation and regain momentum. Denmark has been committed to combating ISIL since the group's emergence. We remain vigilant in hindering a resurgence in ISIL attacks in the region and globally. Denmark reiterates its full support of UNTV and underlines that Israel must withdraw from the area of separation. While we recognize legitimate Israeli security concerns, UNTV must be allowed to move freely and implement its mandate unhindered. We urge all parties to comply with their obligations in that regard. Our overarching goal must be a safe and secure Syria. To achieve that, we need to scale up long-term and sustainable support for early recovery. This can help consolidate and expand the security gains made and mark the beginning of a new era with a safe Syria, where those who could choose to return home receive the support they need. Finally, Mr. President, at this critical time in Syria, an inclusive political process must be front of mind for all of us. Denmark fully supports a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process in the spirit of Security Council Resolution 2254. It is paramount that the Council remains united in this regard. And let me be clear, inclusive peace leads to durable peace. The political process must incorporate all parts of Syrian society. In particular, Syrian women must be in the room and at the table when the future of their country is shaped. This is not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Because as the Special Envoy said this morning, Syrian women have much to contribute with. Likewise, we called for the representation of youth and for minorities. Denmark fully supports the work of Special Envoy Petersen and his call for an inclusive political dialogue. We encourage the interim authorities to heed this call and urge them to share a clear roadmap for a credible and inclusive transition. That includes the build-up of institutions and drafting of a new constitution on the basis of a broad national dialogue. Mr. President, in closing, the challenges facing Syria are great. They're interconnected, but they're not insurmountable. Recent developments offer a rare opportunity for peace. Peace for a country which has endured far too much violence over far too long. The past 13 years have been heartbreaking, but now there's a chance for a new beginning. It is incumbent upon all actors, including this Council, to seize this opportunity. Colleagues, this is a chance that simply cannot be missed. Denmark is fully committed to working to this end, to support a Syrian-led political process that includes all parts of Syria's society, that paves the way to a peaceful and stable future for all Syrians. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd also like to thank Special Envoy Pedersen and OCHA USG Tom Fletcher for their timely briefings and their tireless and dedicated efforts. The choices we make today, big or small, will shape Syria's trajectory for decades to come. Thus, it is essential to think beyond the present crisis and make decisions that will stand the test of time. I would like to make the following points in this regard. First, all hostilities across the country must cease. As Syria emerges from 14 years of brutal conflict, it is crucial that no party reignites hostility or deepens tensions for their parochial or short-sighted interests. On that note, the IDF's expansion beyond the demilitarized buffer zone and the Israel Prime Minister's directive for the IDF to remain in Mount Hermon until at least the end of 2025 is concerning. These actions mark the first occupation of new Syrian territory since the 1970s, an explicit violation of the 1974 agreement and the blatant obstruction of the mandate of UNTV. And this places the Syrian caretaker government in a difficult position as it strives to establish legitimacy at this critical juncture. Such Israeli actions against Syria's territorial integrity must cease as soon as possible. Also worrisome is the continued fighting in northern Syria between the SDF and SNA, which undermines prospects for a peaceful and inclusive transition while offering Daesh maneuvering space to rebuild and recruit. We urge international actors to exercise influence over the parties to immediately halt the violence and seek a constructive and mutually acceptable solution. Second, all relevant actors on the ground must prioritize actions to counter Daesh's resurgence. Experts, including the monitoring team of the 1267 Committee, repeatedly warned of this threat last year, yet such warnings seem unheeded. SDF and the Syrian military facilities have been consistently attacked over the last month, weakening their ability to contain Daesh. Meanwhile, reports indicate that Daesh's resurgence in Syria has resulted in closer coordination with its international operatives beyond its border. Halting this cross-border threat must become an immediate priority for all concerned parties. Third, we urge the caretaker government to align its ongoing transitional efforts with Resolution 2254, which remains a cornerstone of the peaceful and inclusive transition of Syria. The Assad regime's collapse itself does not constitute the implementation of the resolution. Rather, it is merely a starting point. Resolution 2254's main objectives, an inclusive transitional government, a new constitution, and the free and fair elections for all Syrians, have yet to be fulfilled. We trust that these agreed-upon objectives will guide the actions of Syrians and others moving forward. Fourth, the international community must double down on alleviating Syria's humanitarian and economic challenges in an urgent manner and from a long-term perspective. In this regard, we reiterate our support for the early recovery strategy announced by OCHA last year. We also welcome the recent U.S. general license for Syria, which will help ease the country's economic hardships. At the same time, despite the recent scaled-up aid and unimpeded cross-border operations, Syria's crippled economy and devastated infrastructure is compounded by new IDPs and refugee returns. Recognizing UNHCR's call on all states to respect the principle of non-refoulement at all times, We hope that the international community's enhanced engagement on early recovery implementation will lay the favorable foundation for the safe, voluntary return of Syrian refugees. Mr. President, in closing, the Republic of Korea reaffirms the importance of the UN in facilitating an inclusive, Syrian-led political process, and we look forward to a successful national dialogue organized by the caretaker government in due course. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. First of all, I wish to thank Special Envoy Pedersen and USG Fletcher for their briefings. At present, the situation in Syria is at a critical stage with daunting challenges. The international community should strengthen its solidarity and coordinate its actions to support and help Syria achieve stability and development. I wish to make 4 points. First, China supports a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process in accordance with the spirit and principles of Council Resolution 2254. The international community must effectively respect Syria's right to pursue a path of development in line with its national conditions and allow the Syrian people to decide on their country's future based on their will. China notes that the National Dialogue Conference scheduled for January the 5th has been postponed. We expect the Syrian parties to start an open and inclusive political settlement process in the long-term interests of the country and its people. China supports a greater role for the UN and Special Envoy Pedersen in that process. Second, no matter how the domestic situation in Syria develops, the bottom line of zero tolerance for terrorism cannot be changed. The Council recently issued a press statement on Syria, defining that states should combat all terrorist organizations listed by the Council and deny safe haven for terrorists. It is reported that the Syrian army has recently granted senior military ranks to a number of foreign terrorist fighters, including the head of Council-listed terrorist organization, the Turkestan Islamic Party, also known as the East Turkestan Islamic Movement. China is gravely concerned about this. We call on Syria to fulfill its counterterrorism obligations and to prevent any terrorist forces from using the Syrian territory to threaten the security of other countries. Third, Syria has one of the worst humanitarian situations, with more than 16 million people in dire humanitarian straits, and the prolonged illegal unilateral sanctions have further aggravated the suffering of the Syrian people. The international community should increase its assistance to Syria. The UN should play a coordinating role, speeding up the implementation of humanitarian projects and prioritizing the needs of the population to survive the winter. The Syrian parties should abide by the international humanitarian law, cooperate actively with humanitarian operations, and ensure humanitarian access and the safety of humanitarian personnel. Fourth, the Golan is internationally recognized as occupied Syrian territory. Resolution 497, adopted by the Council, determines the legal status of the Golan and makes it clear that the Israeli occupation of the Syrian Golan is null and void. China reiterates that the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria should be respected, that the Council's resolution on the Golan must be implemented, and that the 1974 agreement on disengagement of forces should be complied with. In closing, I would like to reiterate that China has long pursued a policy of friendship and cooperation with Syria and has never interfered in its internal affairs. We stand ready to continue working with the international community for Syria to have a smooth transition and gradually embark on a path of peaceful development. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China. And I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I also want to thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Under-Secretary General Fletcher for their briefings today. Images of Syrians celebrating the start of a new chapter of their country fill us with hope. However, let us be clear, the wounds run deep and the stakes remain incredibly high, as we heard from Special Envoy today as well. There is much work to be done, and every step forward is critical. Peace is never easy. It must be carefully built. So, Mr. President, allow me to share some of our thoughts on the future of Syria. First, the future of Syria should be inclusive. This must be based on an all-inclusive, Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process, in line with the key principles of the Resolution 2254. All Syrian people must have an opportunity for their voice to be heard and considered. This new Syria must be for all Syrians. We therefore urge a UN-facilitated political process leading to a credible, inclusive and non-sectorial governance. We continue calling for full, equal, meaningful and safe participation of women and minority groups in peace and security processes and decision-making at all levels. Second, the future of Syria must be safe and secure. As pockets of violence and conflict still persist, we call for full respect of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. This includes any law enforcement operations. The fighting still witnessed in northern Syria must cease. We need a solution that protects everyone's security interests, including our collective security interest in fighting Daesh. Syria cannot be used as a base for terrorism. Any remaining stockpiles of chemical weapons in Syria must be secured and safely destroyed. The same goes for explosive remnants of war, which continue to pose high risk to human lives and livelihoods, including food security. Sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity and unity of Syria must be respected. We remain deeply concerned about the situation in the area of separation. 1974 disengagement agreement must be implemented in its entirety. Finally, the future of Syria must be based on protection. Civilians' critical infrastructure and humanitarian facilities must be safeguarded and unimpeded access to humanitarian aid granted. Providing conditions for safe and dignified life for all is of crucial importance. We welcome the scaling up of assistance in areas where conditions allow. We join the calls for additional international support for the efforts of the UN and humanitarian organizations. We also call for respect and protection of human rights, in particular for the rights of women and girls and of minorities. With a high number of detained, abducted and missing persons, it is crucial that all Syrians know the fate of their loved ones. Answers for families of the missing will open path to closures at individual level and reconciliation at a society level. A fundamental element of lasting peace is also accountability. We welcome recent visits of the Commission of Inquiry and IIIM in the country and call on all relevant actors to cooperate fully with these institutions. We also underline the importance of preserving evidence, including physical and digital records of former detention centres, and to protect gravesites, cemeteries and morgues. Mr. President, opportunities lie ahead as the process of shaping a new Syria finally begins to take its place. We sense a wave of optimism, and we welcome encouraging signals from the caretaker authorities. However, while statements may sound promising, their true value lies in the actions that will follow. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia. I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Mr. President, my delegation would like to thank the presidency of this council for convening this meeting, as well as the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Tom Fletcher, and the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, Mr. Geir Pedersen, for their very valuable briefings. Panama is concerned about the complex and changing situation in Syria, and we take note of the updates from the field, particularly with regard to the process of dialogue. We reiterate the urgent need to put an end to hostilities, and we underscore that stability in Syria is essential in order to guarantee security and peace throughout the entire region. Panama supports the efforts of the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, Mr. Geir Pedersen, and we firmly support a peaceful political transition that is led by the Syrian people, founded on the principles of inclusion and transparency, leading to a new constitution and free and fair elections. We highlight the importance of the implementation of the proper implementation of Resolution 2254 with regard to its spirit and principles in order to bring about political reconciliation, stability and peace in Syria. Sustainable peace in Syria will only be possible if it is built on a focus that reflects the aspirations and the diversity of its people, respecting cultural, religious and ethnic traditions that make up the social fabric of the country, recognizing and guaranteeing the rights of women and of girls and their role in maintaining peace and in the post-conflict reconstruction process, and also ensuring the inclusion of all communities in the building of their future. Panama reiterates that the protection of civilians should be at the heart of any effort to resolve the conflict in Syria, and we urge all of the parties involved to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, ensuring the protection of civilians from the effects of the conflict. Access for humanitarian assistance, unrestricted access, is fundamental in order to address the urgent needs of millions of Syrians affected by the conflict. Reconciliation and reconstruction in Syria will only be possible if priority is given to the needs of all civilians. We express concern at the unstable situation in the area of operations of the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force, UNDOF. This is a situation referred to in the Secretary General's report of the 2nd of December 2024. Panama supports the Separation of Forces Agreement of 1974 and its complete implementation, and we call upon all the parties to respect this agreement and abstain from any activity which would compromise the safety of the blue helmets. Panama highlights the importance of the role it plays in international peace and security, preventing non-state actors gaining access to weapons of mass destruction. For Panama, the Chemical Weapons Convention is a fundamental pillar of global efforts to guarantee collective security. This is why Panama fully supports the work of the Technical Secretariat of the OPCW, and we underscore the importance of guaranteeing the conditions which are necessary for the organization to be able to move towards the total elimination of the chemical weapons program in Syria. Panama reiterates its support to UN specialized agencies to make progress in the search for those detained and disappeared, as well as the collection of evidence. This process will be key in order to bring about justice and accountability, which will contribute to consolidating the process of political transition. Mr. President, Panama will continue to support inclusive and sustainable solutions which give a priority to regional stability, the protection of civilians, and respect for international law. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Panama. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Special Envoy Mr. Pedersen and Under Secretary General Mr. Fletcher for the detailed briefings. the participation here sheds valuable light on the issue at hand. Mr. President, Greece welcomes the fall of Assad's authoritarian regime in Syria in what constitutes a watershed moment for the country and the region. However, the situation on the ground is fluid, and it comes both with opportunities and risks. Hopefully, in the wake of this momentous development, Syrians deserve peace, a peace that must and can only be assured through an orderly and fully inclusive political transition towards a legitimate, representative and non-sectarian government based on democratic legitimacy in the spirit of UN Security Council Resolution 2254. Mr. President, in line with these principles, Greece supports the unity, independence, territorial integrity and sovereignty of Syria. No effort should be spared for the protection of all affected civilians, including Christians and all religious minorities and ethnic groups, as well as to safeguard Syria's rich cultural heritage and religious monuments. Greece also attaches great importance to guaranteeing the security and the prosperity of a historical Greek Orthodox community in Syria, which also includes Greek citizens. Syria must demonstrate significant and tangible evidence of their willingness to work towards a smooth transition of power, to build state institutions in line with the principle of inclusiveness, and to respect international humanitarian law. Any positive declaration and messages by the new authorities have to be matched with concrete actions on the respect of minorities and human rights. We fully support the UN Special Envoy's engagement and echo the messages he has conveyed to Syria in this regard. Greece stresses the importance of a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned, fully inclusive political process, free of foreign interference, the only viable pathway towards a permanent cessation of hostilities in the war-torn country. In this vein, we strongly encourage Syria to work with the UN Special Envoy with the goal of producing a clear roadmap and a timeline for a political transition process and constitutional reform in spirit of Resolution 2254. Mr. President, Greece remains ever vigilant regarding the increasing risks of ISIL's and other terrorist group resurgence in the country, including the risks of foreign terrorist fighters in Syria and the wider region. Syria must also abide by all relevant resolutions of the Council regarding non-conventional weapons and cooperate with the international community, particularly on chemical weapons stockpiles. A key priority should be facilitating the safe and voluntary return of Syrian refugees to their home, which they have craved for far too long and which is a recognized priority of the international community. We fully support the efforts of UNHCR, OCHA and all other related agencies of the UN system in this regard. Mr. President, let me also underline a deep concern for the potential regional ramifications of the recent upheaval in Syria, calling for all parties to practice self-restraint, respect international law and Syria's territorial integrity and sovereignty. We appeal to all actors in the region to contribute in a responsible and sincere manner to the stabilization and reconciliation efforts of the international community. It is also crucial that all regional stakeholders refrain from acts that could jeopardize the political transition in the country for the sake of their own foreign or domestic political goals. Mr. President, since the October 7th terrorist attack, instability has swept in the Middle East with devastating global ramifications. As demonstrated by the Greek Prime Minister's visit to Beirut on December 16, we are ready to support all regional partners in this volatile environment and will continue to monitor closely regional developments and the potential impact on neighboring countries, particularly Lebanon, Jordan and Iraq. Mr. President, as a final note, Greece expects its full support to UNDOF and the implementation of its mandate and calls on all parties to respect the 1974 disengagement agreement and fully abide by its terms. Mr. President, let me conclude by reiterating our steadfast commitment to the vision of a peaceful, prosperous and democratic Syria, to the realization of which we shall continue to contribute through our strong and long-standing ties with the Arab world and our regional partners. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece, and I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
I thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we thank Special Envoy Peterson and Under-Secretary General Fletcher for their invaluable briefings to the Council this morning. Syria is yet another fraternal country of Pakistan, which has been ravaged by internal divisions and external interventions. Today, Syria is at an important juncture in its history. The recent political developments offer the opportunity to restore normalcy, stability, and peace in Syria. Yet this will depend on ensuring a peaceful transition to a new governance structure which is inclusive and stable and ensures Syria's unity and territorial integrity. Mr. President, I would like to make 5 points. First, Pakistan welcomes the positive statements and assurances from the leaders and representatives of the new interim government. These must be translated into policies and implemented in practice. Political inclusivity and representative governance should be achieved through a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned process based on the principles of Resolution 2254, with the support of the United Nations Special Envoy as well as of the Security Council. Second, the international community and this Council must address the danger of terrorism within and from Syria, especially in view of the still unsettled parts of the country. The antecedents of some of the groups and the reported presence of foreign fighters dictates caution. Any resurgence of al-Qaeda or ISIS and their affiliated groups cannot be accepted. The monitoring team of the 1267 Sanctions Committee should continue to follow and report on the situation. This would also provide the basis for the easing and eventual elimination of the Syria-related sanctions. The Council should also seek objective information on the alleged presence of chemical weapons or capabilities in Syria. Third, we must address Syria's massive humanitarian crisis immediately and unconditionally. 17 million Syrians, more than 70% of the population, are in need of humanitarian support. Over 13 million Syrians have been displaced, 7 million internally, and 6 million abroad. The recent escalations have further added to these needs, with more than 1 million people displaced in a few weeks' time. The UN Humanitarian Response Plan, which is only 33.3% funded, must mobilize all the resources required to meet the urgent needs of the Syrian people, including for the safe and dignified repatriation of Syrian refugees, notably the millions in Turkey. We welcome the scaling up of the UN-led humanitarian operations, as we have been informed today by Under-Secretary General Fletcher. Fourth, Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity must be restored. Israel's occupation of the Syrian Golan Heights is illegal and null and void, as declared by Security Council Resolution 497. The Council must demand Israel's complete and full withdrawal from the Golan Heights. We strongly condemn Israel's further incursion into the separation areas established under the 1974 disengagement agreement and its attacks on UNDOF peacekeepers. This incursion must end forthwith and the safety and security of UN peacekeepers assured. In this context, an immediate end to Israel's aggressive actions in Gaza and the wider Middle East is also essential for the stabilization of the situation in Syria and other parts of the region. Fifth, the international community should help the new Syrian authorities to revive Syrian institutions and implement plans for the early reconstruction of their devastated country. The necessary exemptions from sanctions should be issued to enable such reconstruction. Mr. President, the role of the United Nations, especially the Security Council and the Secretary General, will be indispensable to ensure effective action on all the above-mentioned aspects of the challenges confronting Syria and its proud and resilient people. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to start by thanking Special Envoy Pedersen and USG Fletcher for their briefings and for their team's work in Syria. I'll make 3 points today. First, as we mark the start of this new year, the first for over half a century without the Assad family in power in Syria, this is a moment of hope for the future of Syria and the Syrian people. But rebuilding a country is not a place for quick fixes. So we call on all involved to focus on the opportunity to build a democratic state representative of Syria's rich diversity and to take the necessary steps to establish participation across all of Syria's society. We're encouraged by the new interim authorities' timelines for drafting a new constitution and holding elections and national dialogue. We're encouraged by early engagement with the international community and call for continued cooperation with the UN throughout the transitional period. Second, there is much to be done, as we've heard, in the short term to protect civilians and ensure that humanitarian aid reaches the 17 million people who need it. We call on all parties to stop activity that could lead to further escalation or suffering for the civilian population, and to protect vulnerable displaced populations. Since the fall of Assad, the UK has committed a further $76 million to support vulnerable Syrians in Syria and across the region. Third, Syria must eliminate the chemical weapons the Assad regime used against its own citizens. Colleagues, now is the moment to close the Syria chemical weapons file once and for all. We welcome the interim authorities' commitment to secure chemical weapons stocks and their commitment to engage constructively with the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to fully declare and verify the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons. I encourage members of this Council to support cooperation between the interim authorities and the OPCW to ensure these appalling weapons can never be used again. In conclusion, President, we look forward to working together across the Security Council to support the Syrian people in moving towards a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned political transition leading to an inclusive, non-sectarian and representative government. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I would first of all like to thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary General, Mr. Geir Pedersen, and the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Tom Fletcher, for their briefings. The fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime has created an historic opportunity to rebuild a Syria that meets the aspirations of the Syrian people. The legitimate expectations of Syrians are numerous. Reconstruction and reconciliation, justice for the thousands of victims of the regime, prospects for a return to Syria for those that have been forced into exile. That is why the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, Mr. Jean-Noël Barrot, went to Damascus on the 3rd of January, together with his German counterpart, Ms. Baerbock. The ministers spoke with the de facto authorities, they spoke to civil society, and they visited Srednaya prison. That visit bore witness to the horrors that the Syrian people have endured. Mr. President, in the immediate term, the sound of guns across the country must fall silent. This is essential in order to end the suffering of Syrians and to sustainably build the country's future. Fighting must stop in the northeast, and a solution must be found that preserves the security interests and rights of everyone, in particular Syrian Kurds, in respect for the territorial integrity of Syria. All civilians, including persons belonging to ethnic and religious minorities, must be protected. In parallel, it will be necessary to continue the fight against terrorism, in particular against Daesh. It will be vital that the new Syria leave no room for extremism and terrorism. We don't forget that it is from Syrian territory that the November 2015 Paris attacks were planned, and we know that terrorist groups continue to operate in the region. The greatest vigilance must also be seen when it comes to the spread of weapons, in particular those from the Syrian chemical program. The fall of the regime of al-Assad offers us an opportunity to destroy these chemical weapons. Mr. President, following decades of dictatorship and division, Syrians have new hopes for the future governance of the country. France calls for a peaceful and rigorous political transition that is representative of all of the trends in the Syrian opposition and the de facto authorities in the spirit of the principles established by Resolution 2254 of the Security Council. All of the components of the Syrian people have the right to participate in the debates over the future of their country, and Syrian women belong in those debates as well. The rights of persons belonging to different communities and the rights of women must be protected and respected in the context of the future constitution. These are the messages that were transmitted by the French minister and his German counterpart during their visit. The de facto authorities on this occasion made positive commitments. The United Nations, based on its experience in peace and security and in the spirit of Resolution 2254, have a role to play to support the current transition. In addition to facilitating the political process, the mechanisms established in Geneva to combat impunity and to search for missing persons will contribute to accountability, which is a key element in reconciliation. Mr. President, in the context of the transition process, France stands ready to support the Syrian people as it has always done since 2011. During his visit to Damascus last week, the Minister shared our readiness to provide technical expertise to support the transition, including in constitutional affairs and the fight against impunity. France will continue its humanitarian support for the Syrian people. It is vital that assistance reach all those that need it through all possible routes of delivery. Humanitarian actors must work safely without hindrance in respect for international humanitarian law. What's more, France supports UNHCR in accompanying Syrian refugees that wish to return to their country in dignified conditions and entirely safely. Lastly, France is following the developments in the Golan with concern. France calls upon Israel to withdraw from the area and to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria, as well as the 1974 disengagement agreement, which is binding upon Israel as it is on Syria. France reiterates its full support for UNTV, the security and capacity of action of which must be preserved. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Algeria. Dear colleagues, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the members of the A3+, namely Guyana, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and my own country, Algeria. At the outset, we would like to thank Mr. Pedersen and Mr. Fletcher for their valuable briefings. Dear colleagues, Syria, a land of timeless history and the cradle of civilizations, stand at a pivotal crossroad. Its people, having endured immense hardship for years, now aspire to build a future of hope and renewal, a future where a united Syria thrives as a beacon of prosperity and inclusivity, embracing all its citizens, regardless of their background. We must support these aspirations. The A3+ firmly believes in the Syrian people's resilience and capacity to shape their own future and achieve prosperity and well-being. Getting there would require a firm commitment to, first, inclusivity. We must maintain steadfast support for an inclusive, Syrian-owned and Syrian-led political process under the UN auspices. In line with the principle of Security Council Resolution 2254, building a brighter future for Syria requires the meaningful participation of all Syrians, especially women and the youth. Second, Syria's unity, independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. The A3+ remains steadfast in upholding these principles. We categorically reject any attempts to divide the Syrian nation or to annex any part of its territory or to violate in any other way the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We continue to be gravely concerned about Israel's actions in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights and its incursions in other parts of Syria. We call for full adherence, full respect to the provisions of the 1974 Agreement on Disengagement and for an immediate end to such incursion. Third, non-interference. External interference will only heighten tensions and exacerbate Syria's challenges. The A3+ strongly urges all parties to respect the principles of national sovereignty and to refrain from unsolicited interference in the country's internal affairs. Fourth, counterterrorism. Instability is fertile ground for violence and terrorism, further destabilizing the region. A resurgence of terrorism in this fragile country cannot be allowed. We call for decisive, coordinating action against terrorism in Syria, in close coordination with the national authorities. Fifth, a United Nations involvement. The A3+ reaffirms its unwavering support for the efforts of the Special Envoy to contribute to a smooth and inclusive transition in Syria. We call on all actors to engage constructively with him in this vital endeavor, demonstrating a shared commitment to Syria's stability and future. Dear colleagues, after almost 14 years of devastating conflict, the Syrian people deserve the unwavering support and solidarity of the international community. And the humanitarian situation in Syria remains catastrophic and demands urgent and unconditional attention. The A3+ calls on donors to mobilize the necessary resources to fully fund the humanitarian response plan. In 2023, the 4 billion HRP was only 33% funded, a level that is both unacceptable and unsustainable. Recent developments, with over 660,000 people newly displaced, 75 of whom are women and children, underscore the need for enhanced efforts to facilitate their safe and dignified return home. The A3+ emphasizes the paramount importance of creating and enabling environment for the voluntary, safe and dignified return of Syrian refugees and internally displaced persons. This requires, first, ensuring security nationwide. The volatile security situation has led to the suspension of humanitarian operations in some areas. The A3+ reiterate its call for a comprehensive and nationwide ceasefire. Second, restoring basic services. Without access to essential services, Syrians will not be motivated to to return home. We urge all stakeholders to support the implementation of an effective early recovery strategy that provides the necessary resources for Syrian livelihood. Third, accelerating economic recovery. Syria's path forward requires renewed economic growth, while humanitarian aid is vital. It's not enough. It's not enough. The A3+ calls on the international community to facilitate Syria's recovery process, including lifting unilateral sanctions, that hamper economic progress. Dear colleagues, the A3+ remains committed to advocating for a stable, united Syria, recognizing that its stability is essential for the broader region. To the international community, the A3+ sends this clear message: genuine collaboration and constructive dialogue are essential to achieving the new Syria to which its people aspire. To the Syrian people, we say, it's time to silence the guns and work together for a brighter future for your country. I thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Security Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's our pleasure to see sisterly Algeria presiding over the Security Council. I would like to congratulate you and your delegation on assuming the presidency of the Council this month. We are confident that you will conduct its work wisely. We thank the U.S. delegation for conducting the work of the Security Council last month. Once again, I would like to congratulate Somalia, Pakistan, Denmark, Greece, and Panama, who recently joined the Security Council this month, and wish them success in their endeavors and efforts. I would also like to thank the outgoing members, Japan, Switzerland, Malta, Ecuador, and Mozambique, for their efforts during their membership in the past 2 years. I deliver the statement based on the instructions of the government of Syria. Mr. President, 1 month has passed since the dawn of freedom has broken in Syria. Syrians removed the chains of oppression and reclaimed the freedom of which they were deprived for decades. They got their dignity back, and they are now able to chart their own future and to build a new era to achieve the hopes and aspirations for which they sacrificed so much pure blood. Today, following the victory of the revolution of the Syrian people, the revolution of freedom and dignity, Syria is entering a new era in its history, where all Syrians come together to build a state of freedom, equality, and rule of law, to achieve prosperity and stability, to turn the page of oppression and suffering and human rights abuses. This phase requires support by the international community to Syrians and their state. This phase requires the support by the international community to Syrians and their state in their quest to build a better future for their country. There was recently a smooth transition of state institutions to the caretaker government, which was established for a period to end by the beginning of next March. With this, the Syrian people has taken the first step on the right track by preserving state institutions and preventing their collapse, knowing full well what such a collapse, what disastrous consequences such collapse could lead to. And this is something we have seen in other states. The caretaker government is working on ensuring security and stability, on meeting essential needs and providing essential services. It is preparing for a national dialogue conference to discuss the next phase and establish a transitional government to oversee preparations for national processes, including the drafting of the constitution and the holding of elections. Mr. President, Syrian authorities stressed their commitment to maintain the independence, sovereignty, unity and territorial integrity of Syria. They also expressed their will to build friendly relations with all UN member states based on mutual respect, constructive cooperation and shared interests, away from the policies of polarization. Syrian authorities also stressed that the new Syria is willing to play a positive role on the international arena. It will be a positive contributor to the promotion of international and regional peace and security, and it will not engage in any conflict or war. Syria calls upon the members of the United Nations to respect the will of the Syrian people and its national choices, to support state institutions and their efforts to recover security and stability and prosperity in the society. For this reason, external actors should not interfere. They should not interfere with the political process. Foreign actors should not seek to achieve gains that go against the interest of the Syrian people and their country. All statements and practices seeking to instigate discord and chaos or threaten civil and societal peace in Syria should stop immediately. And I repeat, should stop immediately. Stop immediately. All statements and practices seeking to instigate discord and chaos or threaten civil and societal peace in Syria should stop immediately. In this vein, my country, Syria, would like to express its thanks and appreciation to all states that expressed their support to the Syrian people and their will, that sent their delegations to Damascus and made calls with the new Syrian leadership, that hosted the Syrian government delegation and provided support and help to the Syrian people in this very critical phase of our history. Syria stresses that today it opens a new page in its history, a bright page in the future of foreign relations of Syria in support of prosperity and in support of the safety in the region and stability in the region. Mr. President, Syrians have suffered for long years. It is high time they breathed a sigh of relief and lived a dignified life just like other people in the world. It is high time to end the suffering, to enable Syrians to live in security and prosperity, to live a dignified life in their country, to build a better future for their country. For this reason, we call upon the United Nations and its member states to immediately and fully lift the unilateral coercive measures, to provide the necessary financing to meet humanitarian needs and recover basic services, mainly the electricity, to support early recovery projects and livelihood projects and sustainable development, to rehabilitate and reconstruct the damaged services facilities, to ensure demining and to get rid of unexploded remnants of war, and to provide a conducive environment for the dignified return of refugees and displaced to their cities and homes. In this vein, we note the expansion by the United States of the scope of exemptions for the unilateral coercive measures imposed on Syria. We call upon the United States and other countries to fully lift these measures imposed on the Syrian people, because they originally targeted the previous regime and its criminal tools. Syria believes in the partnership with the United Nations and its member states. It is committed to promoting cooperation with it to improve the living and humanitarian conditions of Syrians, to provide them with basic services, to achieve their aspirations of a present and a future worthy of Syria's civilization, the blood of its martyrs, and the sacrifices of its people. Mr. President, Syria stresses the need to ensure that Israeli occupation entity does not take advantage of the current circumstances to violate Syria's sovereignty in an attempt to impose a new reality through their military incursions to new parts of Syria in Jabal al-Sheikh, al-Qunaitra Governorate, and other areas. We stress the need to compel Israel to respect the 1974 disengagement agreement and relevant Security Council resolutions, mainly resolutions 242, 338, and 497, and ensure the withdrawal of Israeli forces from areas they have recently entered. The withdrawal of Israeli forces from areas they have recently entered and put an end to their aggressive practices against the people of these areas. It is important to respect the mandates of UNSO and UNDOF. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Egypt.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it is my honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Arab group. We would like to thank you for holding today's meeting. We would also like to thank the briefers for their briefings, Mr. Geir Pedersen, the Special Envoy for Syria, and Mr. Tom Fletcher, the Undersecretary General. Mr. President, Syria is going through a historic transformation that will have repercussions not only on our brethren in Syria, but also on the entire Middle East. The Syrian people has suffered for over 13 years from a humanitarian tragedy that they did not deserve. This tragedy has led to infighting, to acts of violence, to occupation and attempts to divide their territory, to internal and external displacement, to the spread of terrorist groups, and to economic repercussions that drove the majority of Syrians below the poverty line. Today, the Syrian people is facing a grave challenge related to a political process and a transitional period that should not be taken lightly. We must all make sure that this process is safe and is running smoothly and properly with the full support to the Syrian people. Mr. President, the Arab Group reaffirms the support of Arab countries to the Syrian people to make sure that the current era is a starting point for a bright future. We would like to reaffirm the following points in our firm position vis-à-vis this crisis. 1. The Arab Group reaffirms that Arab countries never abandoned Syria during its past plight. Our current support did not happen on the spur of the moment. It reflects honest intentions toward the Syrian people. Arab countries made great efforts in the past through many frameworks, including the Arab Liaison Committee, to advance the political reform process in Syria, to bridge differences between stakeholders, to urge the former regime to respond to the request for change, to put an end to the infighting, to stop the bloodshed, and to protect Syria and its unity. Arab countries also contributed to providing humanitarian support to the Syrian people over the past years, especially during the 2023 earthquake crisis. We also hosted our Syrian brethren and welcomed them in their second homes. We reaffirm that Arab countries continue to strongly support the current political process in its right path, for it is our obligation and it is the right of the Syrian people. You are part of our region. You are our Syrian brothers and sisters. 2. The Arab Group reaffirms the sovereignty, territorial integrity, unity and independence of Syria. We condemn the ongoing Israeli occupation of the Syrian Golan, occupied since 1967. We condemn Israel's opportunistic exploitation of the current situation to occupy further Syrian territory, to bomb cities, facilities and infrastructure. This is a blatant violation of international law and UN Charter. It is a violation of the disengagement agreement of 1974. We call on the Security Council to intervene to maintain security and peace, to put an end to the Israeli act of aggression, to put an end to the Israeli occupation. We also call for the end of the illegal presence of all foreign forces in Syria. 3. The Arab Group stands in full solidarity with Syria and the Syrian people in this historic moment. We will continue to support efforts to rebuild the state through a comprehensive Syrian-owned and Syrian-led political process that includes all segments of the Syrian people and their national forces, that aims to ensure an active participation of all Syrians to build a better future for their state and to build national institutions with the support of the League of Arab States and the United Nations, pursuant to the spirit and principles of UN Security Council Resolution 2254, so that Syria can regain its natural standing. We also reaffirm that drafting this process will only take place when there is an end to the destructive external interventions, and all national parties in Syria must give precedence to the interests of the Syrian people above all other consideration, to guarantee the security, unity and sovereignty of Syria, to put an end to terrorism and to maintain the rights of the Syrian people without exception. 4. The Arab Group condemns the activities of terrorist groups that seek to exploit the current void. It is important to strengthen all efforts to combat terrorism, given that this is an international risk that threatens the stability of the international community. 5. The Arab Group calls for further efforts to address the current humanitarian crisis in Syria, to provide humanitarian support to the Syrian people, including by cooperating with relevant UN agencies. We also call for supporting reconstruction and for providing the necessary political, living and humanitarian conditions to start a voluntary, safe and dignified return for Syrian refugees and IDPs, and provide all necessary support in cooperation with relevant UN agencies. And we call for providing further resources to UN mechanisms, including the Syrian humanitarian response plan that is still underfunded. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Arab Group reaffirms its position vis-à-vis supporting Syria and not abandoning Syria. The security of Syria is a main cornerstone of our Arab national security, and we will maintain and protect the security of Syria as we maintain and protect the security of our countries. We will continue to stand with the Syrian people until they achieve their aspirations to a stable and prosperous country as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Egypt. And I now give the floor to the representative of Iran.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Mr. President, I extend my heartfelt congratulations to Algeria on assuming the presidency of Security Council this month. I also warmly congratulate the newly elected council members, Denmark, Greece, Pakistan, Panama, and Somalia on the election. Additionally, I'll take this opportunity to express my appreciation to the outgoing elected members, Ecuador, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, and Switzerland, for their dedicated and commendable efforts during their 2 years, tenure on the Council. We thank Mr. Peterson, the Special Envoy, and Mr. Fletcher, the Under Secretary, for their insightful briefing. Mr. President, on the ongoing situation in Syria, I wish to make the following points. First, the Islamic Republic of Iran reaffirms its steadfast commitment to the Syrian sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. Decision about Syria's future must be made exclusively by the Syrian people, free from any external interference or imposition. Iran advocates for the formation of an exclusive government through free and fair elections and a comprehensive national dialogue that ensure representation for all ethnic, political, and religious groups. We strongly believe that the principles and mechanisms outlined in the UN Security Council Resolution 2254 are essential and applicable to Syria's current situation. A key priority is the drafting of a new constitution, which will serve as the foundation for Syrian future governance. The timeline specified in Resolution 2254 is both practical and achievable, and any delays in this process risk deepening internal divisions and further destabilizing the country. Iran fully supports the efforts of the UN Special Envoy, Mr. Peterson, and commends its active engagement in advancing this critical objective. Second, Iran's presence in Syria has been legal, aligned with international law, and carried out at the request of the former Syrian government. Iran participated in an advisory capacity to combat terrorism, aiming to prevent insecurity from spreading throughout the region. Similarly, Iran's withdrawal from Syria has been conducted in a responsible manner, with careful consideration of potential impact of the Syrian people. Nevertheless, achieving peace, stability, and security in Syria, ending foreign occupation, and ensuring a Syria free of terrorism remain the cornerstones of Iran's foreign policy toward the country. Third, Syrian people continue to endure severe economic and humanitarian challenges. with nearly 1.1 million people, mostly women and children, displaced since 27 November 2024. According to OCHA, humanitarian activities have resumed in areas where security conditions allow, yet access remains critically restricted in parts of the northeast Syria due to the movement constraints. Iran commends the tireless efforts of OCHA and humanitarian partners in alleviating the suffering of the Syrian people, rebuilding critical infrastructure, restoring essential services, and facilitating the safe return of refugees and displaced persons are essential steps toward recovery. Equally important, the extraterritorial and unilateral sanctions imposed by Western countries on Syria are unjust and illegal and must be lifted immediately. Exploiting the situation in Syria to impose political conditions and undermine Syrian sovereignty in exchange for sanctions relief severely harms the most vulnerable populations and violate the fundamental rights of the Syrian people. Fourth, Iran emphasized the imperative of respecting the rights of all minorities in Syria, including Alawites, Shiites, and Christians, and ensuring the protection of diplomatic personnel and premises in accordance with international law. Similarly, safeguarding Syrian religious sites and cultural heritage is vital for preserving its identity and unity. All actions must be fully adhered to international law to ensure the safety and rights of all communities. Fifth, resurgence of terrorism in Syria, particularly the covert operations of sleeper cells linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, remains a serious and escalating concern. These terrorist groups retain the potential to reconnect and reignite terrorism across the region, compounding the crisis in the presence of over 60 armed groups, including foreign terrorist fighters with divergent and often conflicting agendas, which had deepened instability and poses a severe threat to both regional and global security. The fate of the thousands of ISIL-affiliated fighters held in camps and prisons in northeastern Syria is a pressing challenge that demands urgent action. These individuals must be swiftly repatriated to their countries of origin based on their nationality and subjected to legal proceedings to ensure accountability. Iran remains steadfast in its commitment to combating international terrorism and stands ready to collaborate with legitimate international partners to address this critical challenge. Sixth, Israel remains the most significant threat to Syria present and future. This occupying regime continues violation of Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity, including its military aggression and ongoing occupation of Syrian territories. It also defies Security Council Resolution 497 by refusing to withdraw from the occupied Golan Heights. With US support and exploiting Syrian situation, Israel has expanded its occupation by occupying over 500 additional square kilometers of Syrian territory and systematically destroying nearly all of Syria's military and research infrastructure. These actions flagrantly violate international law, the UN Charter, and relevant Security Council resolutions. The Security Council must take decisive action to halt this violation and hold Israel accountable for its destabilizing action. Finally, Iran's friendly relations with Syria are rooted in decades of shared history, as well as strong political and cultural ties, and continue to deepen based on mutual interest and adherence to international legal principles. Iran remains committed to playing a constructive role, collaborating with the United Nations, regional partners, and the government of Syria, which represents the will of Syrian people, to achieve lasting peace and stability in Syria and the broader region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Kuwait.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, President of the Security Council for the current month, the permanent representative of Algeria. Dear colleagues, it is my honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, the United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Bahrain, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Sultanate of Oman, the State of Qatar, and my country, the State of Kuwait. We would like to express our support to the statement delivered by His Excellency, the Permanent Representative of the Arab Republic of Egypt on behalf of the Arab Group. We would also like to congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this current month. We stand ready to support you and your team to guarantee the success of this presidency. We do hope that the Algerian presidency will contribute to further UN activities to highlight the current challenges in the Middle East and the world. We would also like to convey our wishes for luck and success to the new members. Allow me also to thank Mr. Geir Pedersen, the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria. I would also like to thank Mr. Tom Fletcher, the Under Secretary General, for his briefing. Mr. President, the GCC countries, towards the end of December 2024, held in the state of Kuwait the 46th extraordinary meeting, ministerial meeting, to follow up on the developments in Syria and Lebanon. Their Excellencies reaffirmed the need for a safe and stable Syria. We chose to participate in today's meeting to reaffirm our determination to assist Syria at the political, economic, developmental, and humanitarian levels. GCC countries would like to reaffirm the following main principles to address the Syrian crisis. First, the need to respect the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria, to reject foreign interferences, to combat terrorism, extremism, and radicalization, and to respect religious and cultural diversity. Second, support the comprehensive and inclusive political transitional process and support the national reconciliation process and the efforts to rebuild the state and to encourage national unity and a comprehensive dialogue with the participation of all segments of the Syrian society to complete a political process that is Syrian-led with the support of the United Nations. Third, reaffirm that the stability of Syria is a cornerstone for the stability and security of the Middle East. GCC countries categorically rejects the repeated attacks by the Israeli occupation forces against Syria, and we call for their immediate withdrawal from the occupied Syrian territory. We reaffirm our position that the Golan is a Syrian territory, and we condemn Israeli settlement expansion operations in the occupied Golan, and we call for lifting economic sanctions imposed on Syria and on providing humanitarian support to the Syrian people. In conclusion, Mr. President, the GCC countries remain determined to support Syria and to stand by the Syrian people at all levels. We stand ready to support you, Mr. President, and your team to facilitate the work of the Security Council during this month and to contribute to maintaining international peace and security. God bless. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Kuwait for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank the United Nations Special Envoy, Mr. Pedersen, and the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Fletcher, for their briefings. And I express my wish to work with them closely in the future. Mr. President, while the end of the Assad regime brings hope for the Syrian people and the region, the challenges ahead remain immense. Years of unimaginable suffering and widespread destruction have left Syria in ruins. The material devastation, the regime's grave human rights violations, and the severity of the humanitarian crisis are evident. We must ensure accountability for the human rights violations and the uses of chemical weapons by the Assad regime. Turkey continues to support the Organization of Prohibition of Chemical Weapons efforts to investigate and hold accountable those responsible for these chemical attacks. In light of the dramatically changed dynamics in Syria, it is imperative that we adapt our approaches to meet the pressing needs of the Syrian people. International community must adopt a constructive approach and facilitate a smooth transition in Syria. It is now time to address the Syrian people's urgent expectations for international support in rebuilding their country. Last month underscored that a wait-and-see approach is no longer viable. Swift and concrete actions are needed across multiple areas to restore normalcy to the Syrians' daily lives. Beyond humanitarian aid, there is an urgent need to build capacity for the public services and critical infrastructure. These are essential for the functioning of the state mechanisms, alleviating the suffering of Syrians, and facilitating the voluntary return of displaced from abroad. It is time for us, for the international community, to shift its focus from exclusively providing humanitarian aid to actively supporting Syria's stabilization, early recovery, and reconstruction. We also believe it is time for this Council to seriously consider the removal of sanctions and delisting measures. Recovery and reconstruction efforts cannot proceed without decisive action in this regard. We welcome the general license recently issued by the United States as an important first step, but it is imperative that the scope of the exemptions be expanded and time restrictions eliminated. Mr. President, we have all reaffirmed our collective resolve to uphold Syria's territorial integrity and national unity. And Turkey actively worked in the field for that for a long time. There is no place for terrorist organizations such as PKK, YPG, and Daesh in Syria. Turkey remains committed to preventing the resurgence of Daesh, which seeks to exploit the current situation. We must also dispel the illusion that YPG STF is separate from the PKK, which is targeting territorial integrity of Turkey and Syria. The rebranding efforts of the PKK have failed. There can be no peaceful and prosperous Syria while the PKK continues to occupy significant portions of Syrian territory. PKK's control over natural gas and oil resources must end, with these resources returned to the rightful owners, all Syrian people. Eliminating terrorism is a prerequisite for building the institutions of a peaceful and politically united Syria. Mr. President, Israel's continued military operations on the Syrian territory are deeply concerning. Such actions violate Syria's territorial integrity and undermine efforts to stabilize the region. The international community must take concrete action to address these lawful acts. Turkey stands firm in its commitment to ensuring a stable, unified, and secure Syria for the benefit of both Syrian people and the region as a whole. We consistently emphasize the importance of inclusive governance in our engagements with the new Syrian government. Our expectation is that the new administration will adopt an inclusive and pluralistic approach, preserving Syria's rich social fabric and adopting a constitution that guarantees basic rights and freedoms. These messages must continue to be conveyed through constructive engagement. The new government requires the support of the international community to fulfill its promises and to meet the expectations of its own people. We urge all member states to engage with Syria's new government and support efforts to stabilize the country, eliminate the terrorist threat, and strengthen its economy. Delaying these essential steps risks missing the opportunity to consolidate the stability has been achieved. Mr. President, since the first day of the Syrian conflict, Turkey welcomed and embraced the Syrian people and saved lives by the millions. As acknowledged by the UN, Turkey's facilitation of cross-border humanitarian operations in Syria has been a lifeline. For its part, Turkey will continue to play a key role in restoring normalcy for the brotherly people of Syria. We will spare no effort in supporting the rebuilding of Syria's institutional, economic, and physical infrastructure. In summary, Mr. President, during all these 14 years, Turkey stood up with its unique position on the border with 900 kilometers and with a lot of deep cultural relations with the brotherly people of Syria, always stood with the aspirations of the people. And hosted so many migrants, brothers from Syria, sometimes at the expense of its relations, even sometimes with allies. But now we are at a point to look forward collectively. I hope this Council will play a better, strong role in the future. My country is ready to cooperate with all of you on this field. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Turkey. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.